Hi, everyone. I am Dr. David Perrodin, and welcome to the Week 3 Fireside Chat for Educational Leadership 655, Pupil Services and Non-Discrimination. It will be February 8th through the 14th, and this is a snowy, chilly, cold module, but I'm going to push some of this snow out of the way right now. Gone! All right, so here we are. Yes, I do have a winter jacket on. It is very cold down here in the recording studio, so that needed to happen for today. So wonderful job, everybody in class, posting, responding to other people's posts. It's been very invigorating. I'm learning a lot. You're doing a wonderful, outstanding, terrific, super awesome job. Keep it up. And hey, we are already approaching our third week of class. So something I wanted to recap. I don't want to frame things as being either good or bad in terms of data, in terms of looking at our special education numbers, our percentages, looking at handbooks. Well, it's a 12th grade readability, yet it's meant to be a middle school handbook. So I think the way to frame these discussions would be, here's an area for additional inquiry to help us to better understand how we got these figures. So let's look into this more. Let's try to understand this. This is a baseline. We can gather more information. Maybe we can get some trend data, but it's a baseline, and we'll have change from baseline. Because once you report something out as being bad, like we have too many OHI students, so this is bad. Well, we need to look deeper. Why are OHI numbers higher? Well, OHI numbers also represent increase in student diagnoses of anxiety and depression and so forth. There isn't a specific area to address those, maybe outside of 504. So that's why OHI is increasing. So what does this really tell us? Maybe it's more of, let's look into how we're meeting the needs of students with a diagnosis of OHI. Do we need more professional development focused on anxiety, depression, and so forth? But I remember being at a board meeting, and it was, school had put a focus on decreasing discipline referrals for students in that building. They presented to the school board, had done a lot of terrific things, PBIS for students. They presented and said, here, look at all of the gains we've made. And a board member said, yeah, but you said you were going to decrease by 50% on referrals, and you decreased by 40. And everyone, they're like, oh no, like we tried so hard. We did so many great things. The students did wonderful things, and we had this growth, and you just kind of toss that out the window. And that happens, right? If we just get set on criteria, we have to celebrate growth, change from baseline. And that's very essential to champion as a special education director and pupil services director, especially at IEP meetings, right? Where people, it's IEP meetings kind of designed to find the areas of need instead of playing to the areas of strength. And, you look at, we didn't hit the criteria, but here's where the baseline was, and look at the change from baseline. That is to be celebrated. So it's just framing things differently. And I think the way that I put some of the questions together kind of already preset this binary approach of like, this is a good figure or this is a bad figure. And really, it's just something that, is it a figure that we should devote more inquiry to try to understand more about? So in week 2, we had Jeffy and Susie. So the ranges of responses from that, very comprehensive. I appreciate your due diligence, contacting the parent, making sure the building principal was aware that you were contacted. This always should be handled at the closest level to the incident. So that you'd want the building to be able to conduct their own investigation on this, and that someone wouldn't always be, contacting district office. But of course, if a parent is upset, they're going to call a lot of numbers and ask for somebody to call back. So in looking at this question, if there is an alleged act of bullying that occurred, alleged act of bullying, we need to make sure that the parent completes whatever form it is necessary to then start that investigation. Now, when I say that, let's imagine that the parent says, I'm not going to complete the form, or the parent struggles with the form because of language skill or cognitive deficits. you have to look at your policy. There's a lot of policies that say the parent has to complete the form for bullying or harassment or threat of harm to self or others. And what's missing is, they can contact this person at the school, principal or whoever, will assist them in completing the form. The school will assist them in completing the form that this alleged incident happened. Then it can go to an investigation, because otherwise it's a barrier. It's a passive barrier to say, you have to complete this form. You didn't complete the form, well, we're not going to do the investigation. So look how your policies represent that. And if there is not an opportunity in your policy to work with the parent, someone from the district, a counselor, administrator, whoever, to complete that, you need to address it. That is a passive act of discrimination. Looking ahead to week 3, so networking. Yeah, getting together with your area districts. I did that when I started out as a new director. It worked really well. 3 or 4 districts, and there's a story that was published about that. There's some other stories about sharing resources. Professional development is a great area to share resources for Pupil Services Nondiscrimination. Behavior, mental health, bringing somebody in, for example, and then having multiple counselors and psychologists, staff from districts, maybe go to one of the sites, and they're all then together receiving the same professional development. It's also important down the road if something happens, if a student completes suicide, or students or staff are in a car accident, and these staff have to reassemble to support each other during that time. They've already worked with each other. They already know each other. So making sure that you've gone through that step. Also, Memorandum of Understanding. So you were telling me some of the stories of outside providers coming into your school. Making sure that you have a Memorandum of Understanding with your outside providers. So I had this happen. I had a nurse who was assigned privately to a student. It wasn't anything that was being compensated by the district. The student had a 24-hour nurse assignment, but one of the nurses tended to leave the building and smoke outside the building. And we would talk to the nurse and say, "We can't do that. It's a non-smoking area." And but continued to do that. And we realized we didn't know who this person's supervisor was. So it took a little bit to track that down. And then we just realized, we should have this process in place, that we should be understanding who it is that is the supervisor of this person. And if we had any concerns that, we could go to. The other part is, did they have a background check? And we want it down on record, right? If somebody is in our building on a regular basis, we want a background check. We want to make sure that it meets our level, our threshold of background check. So make sure you have those Memorandum of Understandings. Could be a mental health provider coming into your district, could be an autism provider. But if that does happen where they are on site, that you have a Memorandum of Understanding, you know who their superior is, who you could contact. And then you also want to make sure that you're not putting that person into a situation where, for example, it's a student with a behavioral need. They're not trained in nonviolent crisis intervention. The student exhibits behaviors that would warrant a calling of the nonviolent team. What does that person do? Are they able to call the team? Are they able to extricate themselves from the situation? I remember working with a district where they had a mental health provider from the community was coming in from 3 to 4 daily to work with a student. The student had difficult time transitioning out of school from school to home. And at that time, 3 to 4, staff were leaving the building, counselors, a nonviolent team. There weren't as many staff at the front desk. And it was about 3:40, the student had a aggressive outburst in this one room working with this mental health counselor. And the counselor was calling for help. Nobody was there. I mean, it was a person at the front desk, but you didn't have a nonviolent team. You didn't have other teachers to support. So it was a situation, too, of looking at that Memorandum of Understanding of, if people are in your building providing services, what are the ancillary services that are available to that student? And in retrospect, did that even make sense to have that person individually there with the student when the student did have a history of behavioral instance, which required a strong support team, knowing now you're having that person you're approving them to be in your school working with the student when you don't have that support team available. So, Yeah, the story of the Sauk County directors that also was a member check when you come into this new as a director to have people that you can talk to, give ideas back and forth to. That's going to be very helpful for you. And also there's a standardization that comes with that. What we did is we standardized things like our information release. So if you're working with medical providers, exchanging information with third parties, we created one that we shared across all of our districts. So we only had to pay the lawyer once, which was good. And then a lot of our districts, the kids kind of moved in and out. So like it was very similar. So when we saw the paperwork, like, oh yeah, that's the same form that we use. In the state of Wisconsin, we have 421 districts, and they all use their own flavor of form for accessing information, their third-party release forms. That's crazy, right? A lot of states have standardized that across the state. We also have 421 different ways to report bullying, harassment, and threat of harm to self or others. In the state of Wisconsin, if you go to Safe Oregon, safeoregon.com, the state of Oregon, safeoregon.com, they have one system, safeoregon.com. And if you call the number, enter online through the system, it's one reporting system. So when students move from district to district, they know it. They don't have to relearn it. Teachers understand it. Parents understand it. It kind of operates on a 911 type format. It's very effective. It's been around 5 years. These are things you need to be aware of, though, as a special education pupil services director, because they lower the passive barriers, right? They lower the passive discrimination to people who might not understand the systems, or students who are transient and going from district to district. Now there's new systems involved. Parents have new systems. This removes barriers. Check it out. It's really a good thing. It's also in some other districts. So I want to give some shout outs here. Well deserved for week three shout outs. Shout outs. Kelly, we're talking about the $78 Orton Gillingham person coming into the district, and how that was really this issue of right to select methodology, right? And I've seen that people who come to IEP meetings and suddenly they want to write them in, have themselves written into the IEP to give professional development for $3,000 and that we buy the books and all of that stuff and programs. And so the thing is, make sure as an IEP team, you're always documenting that we considered the parent request. Okay. But we have our, curriculum coordinator. We have our own programs, until the student has been exposed to those and is not, for example, made progress, if that's the situation, we'd reconvene and look at other options. But there's a key, though, with this. If there was a complaint from a parent on this, the question would be, well, did you consider the parent's request versus just saying, no, we have a program? Always want to be able to say we considered the parent's request. Even if you do a letter back saying we considered your request. We have a curriculum director, a curriculum committee. We work with CISA 2, whatever. This is a program that our district has selected for reading intervention, whatever it be, reading recovery, whatever. And this is what will be available, for example, to your child. So there's a very slight difference in the wording of that, right? You have considered the parent's request, and you're saying you're going to match these services, which you've selected, to the student's needs. Where districts and people tend to get on a slippery slope is if they haven't considered it, just say we don't offer that or whatever, and we're not going to look into it. So, but thanks, Kelly. Becca asked, "What is a reasonable person?" So, a reasonable person, would they reasonably give a professional lecture wearing a very puffy coat? I don't know, but you have to do it because it's only 58 degrees down here right now. So Becca, a reasonable person, I'm reading the legal term here, is a hypothetical individual who approaches any situation with the appropriate amount of caution and then sensibly takes action. It is a standard created to provide courts and juries with an objective test that can be used in deciding whether a person's actions constitute negligence. This does not mean the person has to be perfect. So this was always something that I needed to consider as an expert legal witness, always. So let's say that you have a school staff member, right? A school staff member, a student comes to them and says, I'm considering harming myself or others, right? They overtly, they tell them that. Maybe, even there's other stuff they've written about it. whatever, but it's very clear. And their friends are also sharing that information out with the teacher. So in that situation, like, we'll just pause. What would we expect a teacher to do? A teacher who has had training in, signs of suicide, ideation, how to refer concerns if you have concerns for a student, all of that stuff. So we would expect that a teacher would, take that information and immediately, contact the counselor, contact the principal, like immediately, and be with the student so the student wasn't alone at that point. Maybe bringing the principal or psychologist or somebody into that room. So you wouldn't just say, well, this could be attention seeking, and not do anything further with it, right? So that would not be a reasonable person in that role, because you would expect that a teacher would act upon that. A teacher would do that if they saw that a student was cutting themselves and, self-harm and things like that, that they would take steps through the school protocol to get that student assistance in a very expedited manner. Or even if they had to, it was call 911 if it was something really, really severe. So this is where this reasonable person comes in. So in that role of a teacher, what would you expect that person to do? Now, there's another part of this, discretion. Like, who has discretion? Who feels that they can make these decisions, that they can activate, your crisis team because a student is in a state of crisis. So it's something you want to be aware of. Yeah, you want to be very kind of overt with that. So reasonable person example. All right. And it also gets a professional development. What if, a teacher said, I called the principal and, to make the principal aware, but I wasn't really sure what else to do because we didn't have a training on this. And you go back and you're like, well, yeah, we should have had our annual, suicide prevention, signs of suicide training for staff. We should have had additional onboarding for new staff for induction on this. And if it wasn't there, like if you can't go back to it, if the teacher said, I wasn't trained on this, of course there would be some expectation that the teacher would recognize that as a reasonable person and seek others out, but saying, I went to the person I thought would respond. I didn't know the principal, I left a message, was out of the office for 3 days at a conference. So you want to make sure that your professional development as a pupil services director, everything that you do for professional development, everything that's done by counselors, psychologists, by you, anybody that you bring in, timestamp it. What was done? What's the title of it? What was it intended to do? Keep records of any handouts, anything that was provided to staff, and then your roster of who was present for this information, and keep that in a file. And for new staff that are inducted, figure out how to pare that down into something that's more reasonable than 8 hours of in-service, because they're not going to likely have that amount of time. But that's where, as a pupil services director, you'll recognize what is being done and that is being addressed throughout your district, and you can look and say, listen, we didn't do that this year. We didn't cover harassment, or we didn't cover understanding who to go to if you had questions beyond the IEP at a glance or things like that. So we want to overtly do that. Have documents to indicate that, because what will happen if there's a complaint is they'll say, show us. The Office of Civil Rights, for example, would say, show us when you did this training. Like, when was it on your calendar? Who attended? Where was the agenda for it? Was there a section where they could ask questions? You'd want all of that you could say, yes, it's right here. And of course, they would interview people too. They'd interview staff and say, tell us about the start of school training that you had on bullying and harassment, and how the school would investigate things, what you were supposed to observe, how you would report it as a staff member. All of those things. They would interview students, right? They would say, how do you report these? So all things to make sure that they are done, all activities that need to be done, time-stamped. Here's a day that it happened. Here's who did it, and that you have it available. Michael was talking about inclusion in the general education classroom. You're talking about your son is aware of pull-out services. And your question is, well, why don't we have more inclusive education? So it's my question too, right? 20 years ago, as an administrator, I saw more team teaching, more collaborative teaching between regular education, special education teachers than I've seen today, right? I thought it was going to be a trend. That would be the way things would be. I think block scheduling, like rotating blocks, kind of messed with that. The DPI got real distinct on categorical aid of saying, if a special education teacher is in a regular education classroom and co-teaching, that's different than if they're working with some students with disabilities and other students are getting some ancillary benefit from that. But I think, team teaching and also looping for younger kids. Hey, I have same first grade teacher, second grade, you kind of loop with that. But, the thing is, where does it start? So this is one of those things you don't look at as good or bad. You just say, where are we at with team teaching, co-teaching in our school? Whoa, like nobody does it. Where could we start? What could be one class where we do co-teaching with special education teacher and regular education teacher? What would that look like? How do we put that together as a pilot? And then take it from there. But I mean, that's just one idea, right? But inclusive practices versus pull out. How do we get more inclusive practices? Jay, for the bullying complaint discussion question, you indicated that you would invite the parent to the office to complete in person the bullying complaint form, or you would conduct that over the phone. And yes, absolutely, right? If there was a situation where the parent did not complete the form, because now you're aware of this, like you have enough information from this phone call coming in that this needs to be investigated, and it can't stop just because a parent didn't complete a form that your board policy says parent has to complete a form. The other part of that is if there is some barrier to them completing that form, you need to offer to have them come in and that you would assist them in completing that form, or that you could do it over the phone, or maybe there needs to be a translator involved or something like that. I mean, who knows, right? But I see this often in board policies where they'll say, you didn't complete the form, so we didn't do the investigation. Legally, that will get you nowhere. That is, and ethically, it's a huge mistake too, right? But because reasonable person, right? Somebody would look at that on a jury and say, well, you're a school, you would expect that you're going to have parents, staff, parent turnover and things like this. And some of your parents aren't going to be familiar with the school lingo, that you are going to have parents with some English language or language barriers, that you are going to have some parents with some cognitive deficits. So you would expect this. You're a school. These are people you will interface with. So why are you not having a system that accommodates and interfaces with these people? So yeah, that would be, you can't just do this complete the form policy. So nice job, Jay. Ashley, you were talking about sharing the IEP with, and you said, when we have substitutes come in for paraprofessionals, the wheels kind of fall off because they don't get the same depth of training of, well, here's the behavior plan for this student. And they're like, okay, they don't understand maybe the terminology. They don't know what the nonviolent team is if they have to do that. They don't know what triggers to look for. It's very difficult. You can go a long way by 5 minutes with another para who is familiar with that student, or a teacher at the start of the day, and then a check-in too of, here are key things, and also, making sure that, your paras are never in a situation where they are completely unfamiliar with a student that likely does have severe needs, whether that be medical needs, right, or whether it be behavioral needs. You wouldn't put a sub-para with a student who might require a diastat administration or something like that, right? Because the sub-para likely hasn't been trained in that. So these are situations that could get really complicated when suddenly that morning the building has a high number of staff out and they have to have coverage, and coverage just ends up not being ideal. Especially during COVID, when I had the superintendent class in fall, the superintendents went time and time again to that and said it's very, very difficult to just have coverage, just have enough people to function. So, but again, this is where I think the partner system of this is your partner for the day. You're going to check in at the start. It's not perfect, but it's something. And that is extremely important, because otherwise too, you're going to burn out your paras and you're going to create a situation. Let's look at it from the reasonable person perspective here, that Becca introduced to us. So the reasonable person, if something went wrong where the student had a, behavioral incident and ended up, harming somebody, another student, and this substitute para was overseeing the student in a sensory room or something, whatever it be, you look at that and say, well, this student has complex needs, has a whole behavior plan, people have met, all this stuff together, and somebody was absent, and a substitute who's unfamiliar with the student and unfamiliar with these protocols was put into this place. It wasn't that they malfunctioned, right? That this person handled this incorrectly, or even if they tried to come in and do a bear hug of the student to calm them down or whatever. It's like, no, they, as a reasonable person who is just coming into a school and has no real training into this, they probably acted as a untrained, reasonable person would. And so we are in for the deep freeze here. So where I record this, like I said, it's 58 degrees and really low humidity. There's no heat down here. So this is just me. So I can continue to a little bit cooler. We'd see some condensation, some breath, coming out here, stuff like this. But yeah, it is pretty wild right now, just how cold it is. But it's Wisconsin, so we've got to be ready for that. I was going to say, hear the heat would be coming out of my ears if it gets any colder down here. But all right, everyone's doing a great job, and welcome to the week 3 module. Thank you.